Welcome to episode 313 of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. I'm your host, Morgan, aka Bon Diesel, and this week we'll be talking about some big studio shutdowns. A Sony legend is moving on. CDPR promises to be better. They super duper promise, and much more. Before we get started, subscribe to the Baunfire Gaming Podcast on your favorite podcast app and leave a review over on Spotify or iTunes. Or subscribe to the Bon Diesel YouTube channel and get all of my videos, including this podcast. Thank you to everyone who supports as YouTube members and Twitch subscribers. If you are interested in supporting this podcast and all of my other content, please check out the show description. Gaming news, let's jump into our main story. Casey Hudson, creator of Mass Effect and BioWare legend, really, his studio, Humanoid Origin, is shutting down. Earlier this week, on a LinkedIn post, he announced that they had lost funding and that they were shutting down immediately. They started the studio back in 2021. This was right after he announced that he was leaving BioWare for the second time. They never announced their game. He and others associated with Humanoid had talked about the kind of game they were going to make. They even released quite a bit of concept art and things like that. Their website was full of it. But at least as far as I know, they never actually announced the game they've been working on for the last 3 years. It's pretty likely they were still in pre-production on it. I'd be surprised if they were even in full production yet. These things take time. Like I said before, they cited a lack of funding. I believe they had a deal with NetEase, but as we'll talk about with another former BioWare person, NetEase seems to be pulling back on their investments quite a bit. It's going to be interesting. This sucks. I think it's especially going to be a reality check to a lot of people, because I think a lot of people assumed that of all people who had started their own studios, Casey Hudson was going to have the easiest time getting funding and things like that. And if you don't remember, around 2020, 2021, coincidentally alongside COVID times, a bunch of these studios popped up. And what I mean by these studios, I mean veteran developers at notable studios leaving those studios and starting their own and claiming to be making claiming to be a AAA indie dev making a AAA game as their first endeavor. And this was due to a lot of factors. A lot of developers were at studios who were part of big acquisitions. So this, if you look at like when Xbox acquired Activision, Bethesda ZeniMax, when that happens, if people have stocks, say, in the studio that gets acquired and they work there, there's typically a vestment time. So they have to wait a while after the acquisition, but then they can cash those stocks out and leave and make typically pretty good money. The acquisition tends to improve the worth of those shares, right? So whether it was that reason or others, you saw a bunch of these studios pop up. Another reason was that there was a lot of money flying around. Loans were cheap, interest rates were really low, and what if you don't know, and I only know this because of all the reporting on this stuff, is that for years, and maybe today, but probably not, interest rates were so low on loans that these studios and publishers would take out loans to pay their employees. And then I assume there's some tax stuff that goes on where the interest on those loans they can write off. And I won't pretend like I fully understand it. There was obviously a reason these big companies would do this, though. And when that was happening, that's also when other companies were willing to invest in new studios and new games, and publishers were really throwing money around, trying to get the next big, Fortnite or whatever they were going for. And so you saw all these studios popping up. I remember is it Shinobi 602 on Twitter made a thread one time of like 20 plus studios that were all starting up, and they were all started by people with notable names, and or at least people from studios you had heard of, right? One of them being Humanoid Origin. It started off as Humanoid Studios, I believe, and then they changed their name like a year ago, and obviously nothing happened there. So one of the interesting things about this shutdown is that I've seen no comment outside of that LinkedIn post from the official page. I have no doubt that they're shut down. It's been reported on pretty heavily. But I think it's interesting that like Casey Hudson hasn't posted anything since N7 Day. And due to some other stuff, which we'll talk about soon, it sounds like this downfall had been going on for a while. What's concerning and what's really a bummer is that this happens right before Christmas. For at least people in the West, it's a time where, for these people who just lost their jobs, it's probably not the best time to be looking for work. I imagine a lot of companies are not hiring right now because it's a weird time. You don't want someone to start a week before Christmas, So that sucks. And then obviously the financials of it, hopefully he's taking care of the people with whatever money they had left. And the experiment is over. It's also notable if you're someone like me, who's a BioWare fan / is looking forward to the next Mass Effect. A lot of BioWare veterans left BioWare in 2021, 2022 to go join Humanoid. It includes what I believe her name is Caroline Livingston, who is like is pretty well known for being a voice acting director, and gets a lot of credit for a lot of the really great voice acting in the Mass Effect trilogy and things like that. And she had left. She went to Humanoid. One of the little anecdotes I have is that I started covering Mass Effect in 2021 after the Legendary Edition came out. And in the first few months that I was covering it, I had a few BioWare employees follow me on Twitter and things like that. And one by one, each of them left to go to Humanoid. And so as I thought, I was like, oh, cool. There's, some people from, there's some people from BioWare who are following me. This is so exciting. This is so cool. And every single one of them left. I don't know what's going to happen. You would think that especially people like Caroline would be welcomed back with open arms, but they've also probably replaced her. There's probably someone who was under her or someone from outside. Someone probably has that job now. And so I think I've seen some conversation around of people being like, oh yeah, BioWare is going to bring back Casey Hudson and Caroline Livingston and all these people. And I'm like, I'm sure they'll try. Like, I'm sure they'll try to find a role for these people. But like, they're probably not going to bring back Casey Hudson as, creative director or studio director or whatever. That there's someone in that position now. If I remember correctly, at least the franchise director for Mass Effect is Parrish Lay, who's a veteran of the trilogy. And so it's been interesting seeing that push and pull, especially with Casey. I've seen it's a surprisingly mixed opinion on whether people would want him back at BioWare or not. Obviously, the whole idea of him coming back for a third stint seems unlikely, but, things are weird. Who knows? But I've seen a lot of people, kind of blame him for a lot of the issues with Andromeda and Anthem and things like that. In feeling like, maybe, and this is what I've been saying for a while, is that, there's so many complaints about BioWare not having all of its veteran devs anymore from the trilogy. Like, oh, they can't make good games anymore. I think Veilguard was a very clear rebuttal to that, but, not everyone agrees. But I've argued that if you took that team that made the trilogy and tried to have them make a game in 2024, they probably couldn't do a very good job. They would probably make a game that feels old, right? Because you kind of need that new blood. You need some of that churn to keep ideas fresh and things like that, at least in my opinion. So I'll be curious to see what happens with that. I do expect that Mass Effect Next will begin full production in the spring, if it hasn't already, maybe on a smaller scale. And when that happens, like they will do some kind of hiring blitz, like because after Veilguard has released, over the coming months, if it hasn't happened already, some people are just gonna leave by attrition. There's gonna be some people who are just burnt out working at BioWare, even if it's not BioWare's fault, or maybe it is. You're going to see people, especially people who maybe worked on, the Veilguard for the last 6-7 years. You're going to see those people be like, I want to try something different. I want to do something new. This was great, but I need to try something else, and that's okay. And so they'll need to replace those people, with this whole thing where now we see that BioWare is a one game at a time studio, at least when it comes to full production. They're probably gonna have where they used to have smaller multiple teams, now they're gonna have bigger single teams, right? And we're likely going to see them staff that up at least a little bit. Now we are under the impression, or we know, that there's some BioWare folks working over at EA Motive, which was formerly BioWare Montreal, back with Anthem or Andromeda. I think it was Anthem. And I've been told that at least some of those people are going to be back as soon as Mass Effect is ready for full production. I've also seen some rumors that that they'll get a choice, that if they want to stay on that Iron Man project, they can. And that would probably be people that would get replaced. They would probably become Motive employees, essentially, and then they would replace people over at BioWare. I think people underestimate or don't recognize how much the work from home stuff is changing how this stuff works. If you've ever seen how Ubisoft develops games, especially their big AAA titles, you'll often see 15 or 20 studios on the credits there. Now there will be a lead studio, like with The Division. Ubisoft Massive is the lead studio who's in charge, but then you'll see a dozen studios behind them who helped them through the whole development process. With EA, we may be getting a version of that with what we've seen with people going over to EA Motive, where your job, like your position, may just be with EA, and then they'll kind of stick you where they need you at any given time. That could be frustrating as you bounce around the different projects, but it also may mean that you don't get laid off when the project is finished. And for all the Veilguard people who I've seen who are now working over EA Motive, I bet all of them are happy as can be to be working, rather than getting laid off when Veilguard released, which, at one point in the industry was the standard. At one time, you released a game and then cut like half of your devs. It was a really gross way to do things, and it was kind of dumb in hindsight because you were losing all this talent, right? And the reason is because these big corporations, they're all about efficiency, and they don't want to pay you for 2 or 3 months, to do essentially nothing while you're waiting for the next project to spin up. So, I don't know. I think that is a factor here. And so it just makes me wonder how many of these humanoid folks that they're going to be able to bring back into the fold, even though, the more the merrier, in my opinion. We did see some evidence that this had been going on for a while. The studio head of In Exile even made a comment like, "Hey, Casey called me and about what was going on, and we tried to help him out, and it just didn't work." And it's, again, kind of rings back to the whole idea that there probably just isn't much money floating around anymore. As interest rates hopefully keep dropping, even though I don't think they will. As the economies in general around the whole world, continue to recover from COVID, we may see some of that funding back, but we haven't heard about Embracer Group in a while. We haven't heard about any of the big studios making big acquisitions anytime recently. There is the rumors about Sony with From Software, and Xbox got ABK, but they initialized that acquisition years before. It took a really long time, and they initiated that purchase back when things were cheap, and that's probably partly why they did it. So Feel bad for the people over at Humanoid Origin. I hope they'll all land on their feet really quickly. I'll be curious to see what Casey Hudson does next. I'm kind of indifferent if he would come back to BioWare or not. I would say from a legacy point of view, and if you want the game to return to some of its kind of old school roots, it probably wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Hopefully, his part of trying to dive into the live service, all that stuff with Anthem especially, but even Andromeda to a point, hopefully all of that influences, he's gotten that out of his system if he comes back, and we can get back to just making some good games. Moving on to some other stories. Speaking of moving on, Shuhei Yoshida is leaving PlayStation in January. A lifer there, for a company that, while you see Xbox have all of these customer facing folks, you don't really see that with PlayStation. That they're especially the leadership at PlayStation with Mark Cerny and stuff like that are awkward at best, ambivalent to their fans, maybe as well. You just don't have the same feeling of like where Phil Spencer and other people are, more involved, and that kind of thing. But Shuhei was someone who was very involved with the community. There's one of the kind of dedications I saw to him was from Greg Miller from Kind of Funny, and he has all these pictures of them growing up throughout their careers. It's very funny seeing how young they both looked in the early pictures and what they look like now as older men. So one thing that was interesting is that one of the people responded to him on Twitter and said like, "Oh, I hope you're not retiring." And he, at least in the way he responded, seemed to pretty clearly say like, "Oh no, I'm not retiring. I plan to continue being involved in the industry." I joked that he could do the funniest thing ever and join Xbox. I don't think that'll happen. I suspect he'll kind of do something like what some of the, like, was it Matt Booty or whoever from the Xbox kind of did that. I think he's at Unity now, the engine developer. And I suspect he'll do something like that. He'll get involved with some, private or, smaller situation. I would be amazed if Yoshida wants to, leave Sony and then go to some other giant publisher and continue in that kind of high pressure environment. My guess is that he'll go somewhere where he can relax a little bit, but maybe not. We'll have to wait and see. Xbox is shutting down their avatar editor. This was one of those funny stories that the way it was presented by a lot of outlets was like, Xbox falling apart. More bad news for Xbox, when it's like they're shutting it down because no one used it. Because like I didn't even know they still had the avatars. I assumed that went away with the 360. I think is when that was like that. It was like a big thing to have it back on the 360. I didn't even recall it was on the Xbox One generation still. So it's one of those things where they didn't seem like they were really trying to get people to interact with it. And it was just kind of one of those legacy things that's just kind of hung around over the years. And, now they're getting rid of it because it's redundant. They don't need it anymore because people don't use it. So I can't be bothered by this, but I'm sure you'll find some people who are. PlayStation is reportedly in the early stages of creating a handheld console that will be able to play their PS5 games natively. What's interesting about this is the way it was presented. It was very much, they're going to try to, compete with Nintendo and Xbox. And like, they probably won't, right? Like they're going to do their own thing. They already have the PlayStation Portal, which is dependent on either cloud services now after an update, or playing remotely from your PlayStation at home. I imagine it's going to be something like that, but with better hardware in it so you can play games natively. Very likely they're going to lean heavily on their PSSR tech that they're testing basically in the PS5 Pro, which will almost certainly be a really big part of the PlayStation 6. This will be interesting. Now, what I did find curious is that, very recently we got Phil Spencer confirmed the Xbox handheld being in development, but it didn't seem like it was very close. As well as now we have this with PlayStation. I wouldn't be surprised if this hardware, we don't see it until like the next gen of consoles. And even to the point where, we could be seeing a new Xbox as soon as 2026. I would think that they would wait to release the handheld for a year or two after that, because I suspect, and I could be wrong, and we'll have to wait and see, but I suspect Xbox doesn't want to do another dual SKU release. I suspect they don't want to have this issue of having the Series S and Series X again. I could see them do a digital and disc version of their next console, and try to do some kind of discounts for the digital, or just straight charge extra for the disc. We'll have to wait and see. But I think that Xbox handheld is probably after next gen, and will probably be, it'd be great if it's the power of like a Series S or somewhere between an S and an X, depending on where the tech is at when it comes out. But yeah, the PlayStation thing doesn't seem that crazy. I did see some of the reporting on it be like trying to compete with Nintendo and Xbox. No one's competing with Nintendo. That's a different kind of handheld. The Xbox handheld, the PlayStation, is going to be more in like Steam Deck territory, ROG Ally. Like, they're going to be competing with them. Switch is doing its own thing. Xbox and PlayStation wouldn't be caught dead releasing hardware the way that Nintendo does. And Nintendo would never bother with trying to do things the way that Xbox and PlayStation have done, or at least that's been the recent history, right? So I thought it was kind of funny that they were trying to throw in like, oh yeah, PlayStation's trying to compete with Nintendo. No, they're not. No one's competing with Nintendo, because Nintendo is going down a different path. They are doing a different thing. You could argue that PlayStation and Xbox are going down different paths as well. I think it's curious, and it's especially interesting when I see people try to compare like revenue or hardware sales and all that between these three companies now, because it's pointless. It's such a 2000s way of thinking of the game industry, because they all are going for different things. So much of the conversation around Xbox and PlayStation is how PlayStation has sold twice as many PlayStations as Xbox has their own current console. But that just ignores what the companies are trying to do. Xbox has done nothing to try to outsell the PlayStation in hardware in this generation. They really barely tried last generation either, because they're more of a service focused company out now, right? Where hardware is an option but not a requirement. That's not so true with PlayStation these days. So yeah, this handheld will be interesting. What's interesting in my opinion mostly about it is that Xbox has the opportunity to put out a piece of hardware that at the very least is extremely good with using their own systems, their Xbox ecosystem. They could also be very forward looking and be willing to allow things like the Steam Store, Epic Game Store, and so on onto their platform, and to give people that ability. Like, if there's a lot of people who have games trapped on Steam and on Xbox, if you could give them one device that could play both, that would be a big deal. I think that may be a step too far for the console. I don't know if Steam would ever allow that, but maybe they would. Why? I mean, how does it hurt them? It just means more sales on their platform, where Xbox will have to pay, at least some kind of royalty for that. But with the handheld, I definitely think we could see that. And if it's the choice between that and PlayStation's, locked down to their ecosystem handheld, I think you would see an advantage with Xbox there. But we'll have to wait and see. I just think this generation especially is potentially gonna make some people think like, I mean, PlayStation does have really good exclusives. Every time they release a first party game, it tends to be in the conversation for game of the year. But man, they don't release very many of those anymore, which then kind of cheapens the whole, like, if you have a PlayStation to play those games, but those games only come out every 2 or 3 years, it starts to not feel like as big of a reason to buy into the PlayStation platform. But I could be wrong. CD Projekt Red claims that The Witcher 4 will be better than Cyberpunk 2077 and The Witcher 3, and promises it'll be bigger and better in every way. This came from an interview on Eurogamer, which I personally am really disappointed with. Not surprised though. Eurogamer, in my opinion, is not a great publication, but they still do put out stuff that I think is worth talking about. This whole article was interesting because CDPR, CD Projekt Red, has been treated with such kid gloves. There was a lot of pushback after Cyberpunk came out, and then basically as soon as influencers and journalists felt like it was okay to like him again, it's just been like a complete whitewash job. Like you could fool me into thinking that all of the marketing for Cyberpunk before it came out was just a lie. Or that wasn't, that that never happened, that they didn't lie about everything, including when they initially announced the release date for Cyberpunk 2077. The release date was when it's finished or done or whatever, which proved not to be true. The straight up, in my opinion, extremely shady way that they covered up the last gen, the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 versions of Cyberpunk, in the way that they were unplayable, and they very conveniently didn't release any codes for them. And if I remember correctly, didn't release codes for any console. They only released PC codes for review. So even for Series X and PlayStation 5 players, where the game ran a little better, somewhat, it ran in general. They hid that too, but it was so bad, and I think people forget this, that Cyberpunk wasn't on PlayStation Store for months, if not a year. I can't remember exactly. And with Xbox and PlayStation, there were like blanket returns. It was super easy to return the game. And then there's the point of CDPR took 3 years after Cyberpunk came out to finish that game. And I'm not even talking about that the DLC Phantom Liberty was them finishing the game. For all accounts are that Phantom Liberty is a really, really, really good DLC, and that it's arguably better than the actual game itself. And that's cool. And I'm proud of those devs. I'm proud of the people on the front lines who got that game going again. But everyone above that, and a lot of influencers and journalists and stuff, I just have no respect for it at this point, because if it was any other studio that did what CDPR did with Cyberpunk 2077, every single one of these articles about the next project they're working on would be, very skeptical. And then they do this thing where, and not to mention that one of their executives fairly recently, within the last year or two, basically tried to, trick everyone or just lie about the release date of Cyberpunk, and said like, oh, people exaggerated it wasn't that bad, and blah blah blah. And it was. I had it on I believe Series X. I played it there, and then I have it on PC, and even today it's still not as perfect as you may see people talk about it being. And then not to mention that the game in general is just not the game that they claim they were developing, at least in my opinion. I didn't go into Cyberpunk with the same ideas that others did. I don't like The Witcher 3. I think it's kind of a boring game that doesn't feel good to play. And so I didn't have that hype. And I feel like, people's love for The Witcher 3 really kind of like got them to be very forgiving about Cyberpunk. Even to this day, there's a few people I see online who are like, if Cyberpunk was released this year, in the state it's currently in, it'd be Game of the Year. And like, it probably would be, not because it deserves it, but because the hype would get it there. I still like the main story of Cyberpunk it's good. It has good characters, great voice acting, some good action at times. I think the gameplay feels awful. Personally, I think the gunplay is terrible, both on console and on PC. The hacking stuff I think is kind of clumsy. I don't think it feels that great. I think people see those like Instagram reels of people doing these crazy these kill montages in that game, But whenever you see them do that, it's always just in some like random like five enemies in the middle of the desert. Like it's never in like a meaningful game situation. So, it's a cool video to make. It's a cool clip to put out there. But I would argue that Cyberpunk 2077 is just, it's a facade in my opinion. It looks right. It's got a bunch of the good stuff, but there's no depth. I've said that game is a mile wide and an inch deep. I've said that I think that Cyberpunk would have been better as a more linear story game instead of being this big open world. Like, I've seen people talk about how Night City is the best open world, city in any game. And I really wish there was a way to strip away all of Night City that you can't interact with and show how much of it you can. And you would see that it's very minimal. There's not a lot to Night City. When you run around in that game, whether it's the NPCs just kind of wandering around and not having any aim, where much older games like Red Dead Redemption 2 and stuff, every NPC seemed to have like an agenda, right? Where with Cyberpunk, you very much feel like you turn the corner and all these NPCs just generated, and that as soon as you walk away, they're all just gone. And that's just how all games work. I understand that, but typically games do a better job of making it feel like they aren't, right? And I don't know. I don't get the love for Cyberpunk. I think it's an okay game. After beating it, I think twice now, I'd give it like a 7 out of 10. I don't think it's a great RPG. I think it's got an okay story. I've seen people really, and like, I love like some of the characters like Pan Am and stuff. But, when you play it, you realize that like the romance system in the game and it's been improved a little, I know, in post launch, but like, it's super basic. It's arguably more simple than like the old Mass Effect romance, mechanics and stuff like that. Like, I don't know. I don't get it. But I think, CDPR getting real high on their own supply about like, Witcher 4 is going to be better than everything else and all that. It's like, well, the things before maybe weren't as good as people say they are. So maybe this will be a good one, and maybe it won't take 3 years to finish it after you take everyone's money for it. My conspiracy theory with Cyberpunk is that CDPR spent a metric crap ton of money on PR firms that both very obviously and maybe more subversively really pumped up CDPR and the reputation of them and Cyberpunk by various means. And then I think it worked, because if you dare say that Cyberpunk isn't a perfect game now, you will hear from people about it. So there's my biased take of the week. Speaking of the old Casey Hudson news, Worlds Untold, a NetEase studio led by Mac Walters, who left BioWare after leading Mass Effect the Legendary Edition, is ceasing operations until they can find more funding. So this is, I assume, a similar situation, just being handled slightly differently than Humanoid Origin. If you don't remember, a year and a half ago, Mac Walters left BioWare. This was after he had been the lead on Mass Effect the Legendary Edition. Mac was a veteran of the trilogy and had been at BioWare forever. He's one that I could definitely see him come back, mostly because he hasn't been gone that long, and he didn't really leave in a way of like, he left to join another company, not start another company. And so I feel like it'd be less of a, vertical, or, it'd be less of a vertical move for him to come back. And he's only been gone for a little while. So I'll be really curious to what happens with him, especially. He did seem kind of done with BioWare when he left. Maybe it was a grass is always greener situation, and that grass turned out not to be so green. But again, this is another one of those ones that sucks. This is awful. It's a huge bummer, especially with the timing and the state of the industry and all that. This sucks, and I hope he and everyone else there lands on their feet very quickly. Who I don't hope is successful is, and this was kind of a side story, Elon Musk wants to use his most money in the world for a single person to purchase Hasbro, and therefore purchase Wizards of the Coast, and therefore own Dungeons and Dragons IP, And the suggestions are that he wants to make a new Baldur's Gate game or a new Dungeons and Dragons game that isn't woke, because that's the same dumb topic that all these idiots can't get over. Still, Baldur's Gate 3, which is releasing another patch with like 12 new subclasses, photo mode and a bunch of other stuff. Baldur's Gate 3 is at least a top 2 or 3 game ever made, maybe top 5 at worst. And was quote unquote woke, or had, various kinds of relationships. You could identify as different things. It was very customizable to your own identity and others, in somewhat vague and more natural ways. Talked about a lot of things of people being, trans and things like that. There's a character in the game that you can meet where they don't just pop out and say, "Hey, I'm this thing," I'm this or that. But if you dive into their story, you realize like, oh, okay. And it was really cool and really natural. And I thought it was a really good way to talk about those issues and those situations. Well, Elon Musk will not stand for that. And so now, and what's frustrating with someone like him is he has enough money to basically brute force, as many of these deals as he probably wants to. And so hopefully this doesn't happen. That would be awful for everyone. All you have to do is look at Twitter and realize that, him taking over anything, even if he's not really in charge of the day to day, it's probably not great. So that's just my spiel on it. 8-Bit Dough announced a Xbox themed keyboard and mouse that's currently up for pre-order. They look very cool. It's got the kind of transparent green. It even has a numpad if you're one of the old weirdos like me who still uses those. And there's also a mouse you can get with it. It's all way too expensive in my opinion. I have no desire to actually get these things, but they look really, really cool. And a couple of quick stories here. Troy Baker, hold on to your seats, everyone. Troy Baker is going to be involved in Neil Druckmann's next project at Naughty Dog. I know, you're all falling out of your seats. You can't believe this. That Troy Baker being in a video game at all is the craziest thing in the world, but especially being in a Naughty Dog project. Be still my racing heart. Okay, yeah, of course he will be. And I bet Matt Mercer and you can probably name five other people who will definitely be in this game because they're in every single game ever made. So maybe we'll get a Jennifer Hale appearance. I am curious to what that's going to be. It seems, especially if Troy is in it, I'm assuming it's not The Last of Us 3 for various reasons. I guess we're still doing spoilers maybe. It would probably be good for them to do something else. I think they'll definitely do a Last of Us 3 eventually. And they probably should, from, my knowings of that story. There is more story to tell there. And I think they should. I think that'd be interesting, even if it's for Ellie. But probably be good to do something different. So good for them if that's what they're doing. And then the final story here, that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth director said the industry is shifting away from platform exclusives and wants his games on Xbox. This is kind of what I've been saying or pushing towards is, there's all this anxiety and all this worry about Xbox. Like, oh, they're becoming third party. They're going to stop making consoles, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's probably not true. Like, it seems like they will continue making hardware because there's no reason for them not to. Even, so much of that comes from like, well, PlayStation destroyed them this year or this generation. And it's like, PlayStation has sold 60 plus million consoles. Xbox has still sold 30 plus million consoles. Like, that's a lot of hardware you're moving. Like, that's still a good thing, even if it's not as good as the other guys. But this whole idea of, Square Enix being like, yeah, we gotta stop doing these deals with Sony. So that tells me that Sony probably isn't ponying up enough cash, no pun intended, to really make it worth it for these companies to be exclusive, or at least not, ones as big as Square Enix. Obviously we're still seeing those deals happen between PlayStation and some of the smaller studios. But yeah, like this has been a long time coming. I wouldn't be surprised if we see the Final Fantasy VII remake on Xbox sooner than later, Final Fantasy 16 sooner than later. We recently got, in the last year or so, Final Fantasy 14, the big MMO, which I played for like 8 seconds and realized that that is just not my type of game, and that is okay. Not every game has to be. But yeah, so I truly believe that Xbox is just kind of making moves that everyone's going to have to make eventually. They're just doing them maybe too early, which if you even look back to the Xbox One, as much as they were panned for that reveal and a lot of the ideas they had with the Xbox One, and they deserved a lot of the flack. They were, there's a lot of things about that old system and some of the old ideas that they were maybe even just talking about that have like come true. Much of their old vision for what Xbox would be in the future is what's happening. And I think with their current strategy and what they're doing with everything as an Xbox is part of that. And I don't think it means they're going to stop making consoles. I just don't think it means that they're going to focus on consoles, that's going to be one of the many options they provide. I still do believe that many of their other things, like putting games over on PlayStation, putting games on cloud, putting games on mobile, I still do believe they're doing those things to try to funnel people towards Xbox or PC hardware, because that's where you get Game Pass natively. And you get to play it on hardware, which at least at this point is still preferable to streaming, in my opinion. I don't think, I think this thing with the Final Fantasy VII director, having this feeling, I think that's going to become more normalized, and we'll see more of it. As for a few content updates, obviously this was kind of a light show. There wasn't a lot of news this week, but with the studio closures, I did want to talk a bit about that and whatever else came up. This is a busy time of the year for me, both at work and personally. So sometimes it means I have more time to make content and stream and do all that. Sometimes it means I have no time to do those things. So be patient with me as the time goes on. I didn't even plan on recording this episode until next week. So, life finds a way, or a podcast finds a way, or whatever. So thank you for listening to this one. But yeah, be around, pay attention to my socials. I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky and Threads. I also have a Discord. I also try to update the community tab on YouTube. You can even leave me comments and stuff like that on Spotify on the episodes if you want to. It'd be really cool if you would, actually, as well as reviewing on Spotify and iTunes, because that helps more people be recommended the show. And that is where I am going to wrap this one up. If you have any of your own topics, questions, or feedback, please be sure to let me know in my Discord, in the YouTube comments, or you can hit me up on social media at Bondiesel or at the Baunfire. That is all I have for this episode of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time.